Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Again, keep an eye on the chat box where Garland will be putting important information in. If you have questions for our speaker, please put them in the Q&A box. We are delighted to welcome Simon Rosenberg to this Democrats Abroad webinar. And I will be turning things over to Simon in just a moment. But before I do, I would like to ask Danny Follette, the chair of Democrats Abroad France, to say a few words.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for being here. Many thanks to Simon for joining us today. It's going to be a great event. And also a huge thank you to Amy Porter and Garland Walton for organizing this. Thanks also to Karen and everyone on the tech team for making this happen today. Just a few words about DA and also about voting. Probably most of you know this, but just in case, Democrats Abroad is the international arm of Democratic Party, and our mission is to get out the vote among Democrats living abroad. So in 2020, votes from abroad were the margin of victory in the tightest of races, and we helped elect Joe Biden in Arizona and in Georgia, and we're helping Democrats keep control of Congress. This year, all House seats, all 435 House seats, and a third of the Senate, 39 governorships, and a lot of other down ballot races are on the ballot. So we must show up again in 2022 and find even more overseas voters than ever before, because our democracy depends on it. The registration deadline is quickly approaching. So if you haven't already done so, please go to votefromabroad.org and request your ballot now. Remember to ask for your ballot to be sent to you by email so that it's not delayed by the postal mail. And ballots are starting to be sent out already, so please don't wait. If you haven't already requested your ballot, votefromabroad.org, which I think Garland is putting in the chat. So after you've requested your ballot, there's more you can do to help Democratic cause in 2022. Think about who else you know. Encourage all of your friends and family to get their ballots now, and send out information about voting and the link to Vote From Abroad on your social media and on email and every way that you can contact people you know. Who can you share today's recording with, for example, to ensure they vote this year? And especially contact people who live in battleground states. Finally, please keep in mind that Democrats Abroad is a volunteer-run organization, and we thank everyone who made the suggested donation of $20.22 for today's seminar. Your support really goes a long way, and a donation of even just $10 will help us reach 20 overseas voters. So if you haven't already, please donate if you can, and thank you very much for your generosity. So with that, I'll hand the floor back to Amy. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. It is my great pleasure to welcome Simon Rosenberg, who is going to share with us his forecast for the November election. Simon needs no introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. He is a highly regarded political strategist, a veteran of 2 presidential campaigns, including a senior role in the famous Clinton War Room of 1992. He was a senior advisor to the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and helped craft the successful 2018 Blue Wave strategy that netted the Democrats 40 seats and earned the highest vote share by either party since 1986. In his current capacity as president of NDN, the New Policy Institute, Simon advises leading politicians, administration officials, and policymakers on a wide range of issues. If you follow Simon on Twitter, which I highly recommend, you'll know that for the past year, he has been predicting Democratic wins in 2022. And some of the mainstream media is finally catching up to the fact that the Democrats have the momentum right now. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Garland. Thanks, Danny. And let's just get right to it. I've got a PowerPoint that will take about 20 minutes or so, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. Can everybody see it? Are we good? Okay. So we call this the new bluer election, and let's go and figure out why. Here's my sort of basic overview of where we are right now. That, we've gained 4 to 5 points in recent months, that Biden's approval rating is up by almost 9 points, which is really significant. Democratic candidates have huge cash advantages in the battleground states and districts. We continue to overperform our 2020 numbers in actual elections. The big issue of women, huge surge of women voting and registering is become a really important part of our understanding this election. And Biden obviously closed out very strong. The party's united, and all the wounds from the legislative battles are healing. The Republicans, on the other hand, are a big, ugly mess and are closing as ugly as you possibly can. They're underperforming in polls just about all over the country. They've got money troubles. There's unprecedented infighting. They've not really offered any reason to vote for them. MAGA is getting uglier in the closing days, and their coalition. So the bottom line where I think things are today is the Senate is leaning down, the House is in play, and the election is likely to keep getting better for us as we go forward. But it's really close, and we have a lot of work to do. This was never going to be a typical midterm, in my view. I mean, the first piece I wrote about this was in November of last year, where I saw that there had been a decoupling between Biden's approval rating and what's called the Congressional generic, which is that basic question is, are you going to vote Democrat or Republican in the next election? And usually those track closely together. We already started seeing by November that even though Biden's approval rating had come down, that the generic had not really changed that much and was still positive Democrat. And it's what I postulated at the time was that the Republicans had made a big error, that they had run towards a politics that we call MAGA, that had just been rejected by the country in overwhelming numbers in 2 consecutive elections, and that if they wanted to have a more traditional midterm, they needed to run away from this failed politics, not run towards it. So even then, I argued that as long as they were continuing to embrace MAGA, we had a shot, that there had emerged in America, oops, not sure what happened here, this moved out of line here, but that what had emerged in America was a durable anti-MAGA majority. This is the vote in the last 3 elections. Sometimes people forget, what happened, but sorry, these aren't lined up, not sure what happened here, but our margin of victory in the last 2 elections has been 6.5 points. That's a lot in our business. And since Trump won the nomination, they've only averaged 46% of the vote. And, we've outperformed them by 5 points. So the math for them was always going to be a little bit hard. It meant that they had to get a lot of people that had voted against MAGA twice in many cases, sometimes 3 times, to either not vote or to vote for them. And as we know, both of those things are now less likely than they were given the events of recent months. I started believing that there might be something happening in this election that was different than what was the conventional wisdom in May. I was involved in a polling project of Latino voters in Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. And if you look in the upper left, that's the Biden-Trump number. So in Arizona, Biden beat Trump among Latino voters by 24 points. And if you look here, right, Kelly was up in the 30s. So that was like, hey, that's actually better than 2020. Same in Nevada, same in Pennsylvania. And so we began to wonder whether or not there was something happening in this election that was different than we thought, which is that here we have data that Democrats were overperforming, small part of the electorate, but in different parts of the country. And so it suggests that maybe something broader was going on. And if you look here, in Arizona and Nevada, Trump got in the mid-30s with Latinos. In this next slide, this shows you how the Republicans and Trump were doing at that point, which is they were down in the 20s in these 2 states and even further down in Pennsylvania, meaning that not only were we overperforming, but they were underperforming. They were not hitting their 2020 numbers. So I started looking around to see if this was happening with other parts of the electorate. And it was. This is a snapshot of 538 as of pre-Roe. This is the 2 days before Roe. Bennett was way up in Colorado. Warnock was, tied, which was fine. In Georgia, we were way up in Nevada. We were way up in Washington. And even in some of these Republican-held seats, right, we were doing much better than was conventional wisdom. And if you then also looked at the governor's races, you saw similar things. And what I wrote that week was I wrote that, hey, there's no evidence of a red wave. I mean, this is pre-Roe. These numbers suggested there was a competitive election. I call it the MAGA hangover, that the Republican numbers were lower than people expected because there were still a lot of voters that may have been disappointed in Biden, but they just weren't in any way there for Republicans yet, right? That was the big question. And what I posited in May was in a piece was that, what happens if the mass shootings and the end of Roe and the January 6th committee, all come together to sort of remind voters why they had voted against Republicans twice. It could be very dangerous for Republicans. And that's what happened, right? We had this combination of these things which reminded this anti-MAGA majority about why they voted against the Republicans twice. It's not a party that was somehow different or reformed or better. It was the same people they had voted against in very large numbers. And then simultaneously to that, the economy kept growing, inflation came way down, gas prices came way down, inflation stopped growing, but gas prices came down. The war is going well for us in Ukraine. Biden had closed out this legislative session very strong. So these two things happened simultaneously, and all of a sudden we had a very different election. And this is what, and I'm now going to show you Republican polls. These are recent Republican polls, highly influential Republican polls, not Democratic or independent polls. And it has Democrats in these four polls, an average of 4.5 point lead in these four. Look at the Chamber of Commerce. You can't get any more establishment center right than that. These are all sort of establishment Republican groups. And then these were a series of other Republican polls that had Republicans doing much better. And you can see here, Wall Street Journal had Republicans up 5, you had Rasmussen was up 10, Fox News was up 7. This is where all these polls are today, right? Fox News just came out at the end of last week, +3 for the Democrats. This one we're up +1, +3 in the Journal. So in all of their polling, they're seeing either Democrats ahead or some significant shift. There's no way to really deny that this has taken place at this point. We know from 538 that the numbers have shifted there significantly, but this is what they're seeing. And this is important, right? That this is what their data was showing them. And then I found this poll in North Carolina by a group called the John Locke Foundation, very right-wing organization that does very high quality polling. It was kind of interesting. And, their movement from over the last couple of months showed sort of a similar, dramatic movement. And, again, 4 or 5 or more points towards the Democrats. So it's clearly a new bluer election. And we've got a shot to keep both chambers. That's where I think things really are. What was important was that in terms of getting Washington to accept that this was a competitive election and a new bluer election, the reason I'm showing you this Republican polling is that Republicans started acting as if the election had changed, right? And this is really important because I think this was created permission structure for journalists to start really declaring that the election had changed a lot. You saw this headline in Fox News on July 22nd. You saw David Drucker, who's a prominent Republican-leaning columnist, commentator, just a few days ago, writing "There's no red wave." You saw the infighting between McConnell and Trump and Senator, what's his name from Florida, fighting over what looked like they're already fighting over who was responsible for Republicans losing. I will remind everybody that this weekend, Donald Trump called Mitch McConnell a Democrat and a betrayer of the Republican Party, as if Mitch McConnell is in some other political party than Trump is. And so the level of kind of infighting that we're witnessing right now is really unprecedented in modern American politics. And then you've seen some of these Republican candidates back away from their hardline abortion stances. These kinds of things don't work in campaigns. It starts reminding voters that these are craven politicians and not, and you don't get any, you can't change on an issue this significant this late in an election. It's a sign of desperation. And then you also have this whole issue of there's an enormous organized effort by Republicans, organic and organized, to tell Republicans not to vote Republican. We've never seen anything like this before. We saw it with Trump, but now it's with the whole party, that the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party is causing an organized opposition to Republicans regaining power. We've even seen in Texas, prominent Republicans endorsing our lieutenant governor's candidate. And this is, and what happened was, the simple way to think about this is that Republicans are really fighting public opinion on something that really, really matters to voters. And when you do that, it can degrade your brand. I mean, this was polling done just days after Roe ended, showing very dramatic support, for our position and opposition to the Republican position. And this is, from Navigator, which I encourage you, if you're a polling junkie, to follow Navigator. They come out every 2 weeks. It's very strong polling. This showed a 24-point drop with independents with Republicans, Why does that matter? Because up until that point, independents were leaning Republican. It was very problematic. They were with the Republicans on the economy and sort of with us and everything else. But this caused part of what happened with the ending of Roe is that there was an immediate dramatic change in the election. That's very uncommon. Elections usually change gradually over time. And one of the reasons that I was so aggressive at arguing that things have really changed, because we just don't see this kind of movement, it's usually over 3 or 4 months, not within a few weeks. And so I was pretty confident in saying the election had fundamentally changed based on all the ways that you measure these things. And so where we are now today is Republicans are still struggling to get to 50. And the reason 50 matters is that if you get 50.1, you win, right? So it's a pretty important benchmark for any candidate. And even in places like Texas, the Republicans are not hitting 50%. It's, there's a sense that their ceiling is lower than they want it to be. Their ceiling in the last 3 elections was 46%. So for them to get to 50, it's going to be a big leap, but they're not even getting to 50 in places like Texas. That was 10 points more Republican in 2020 than the national vote, right? So this shows that their ceiling may be much lower than they're comfortable with. And I think one of the big questions is that, can they break past 46? Are they going to pick up voters in this election? I still think that that's an open question. You're seeing in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, their candidates are still closer to 40 than they are to 50. And Bud in North Carolina, a race that we didn't think was going to be competitive, is still polling in the low 40s. It's kind of stunning. Meanwhile, most of our major candidates have hit 50 in some poll in recent weeks. So we're bouncing up against 49, 50, 51. They are struggling even in Republican-held seats to do the same. And this is just polls now in the last few days, right? This is just major media polls in the last few days. New Fox poll shows us gaining 3 since their last poll. The NBC poll, which was kind of a grumpy poll, frankly, a few weeks ago for us, got better for us by 2 points. The New York Times got a point better. And what's really important is that the Fox News poll, they said in their modeling at +3, Democrats keep the House. This was Fox News on Thursday, national poll saying Democrats at this point were on track to keep the House. Obviously kind of a shocking conclusion from Fox News, but it's my belief that we have to be at somewhere between 2 and 3 points to be competitive in the House. I think we're there, today. So this is a very competitive election. So there is no evidence of the election moving back towards the Republicans. In fact, all the data shows that things are continuing, that if anyone has any momentum, it's us. This is the Senate races as of this morning or an hour ago on 538. The Democratic held seats, the Republicans had this fantasy during the red wave fictional era that Washington and Colorado might be in play. These races are not. I put them up there just because I was at a dinner last night with Republicans who told me they thought they were going to win in Colorado. I still sort of stunned at that. Arizona, we're in good shape. New Hampshire, we drew the right candidate. We got not just a MAGA, but a super crazy MAGA. In New Hampshire, a state that is not a state of extremists. Nevada, this is a close race, but remember, she only won by 2 points last time. Nevada's always close. It's always close. It's always going to be 2, 3, 4 points. It's never, she's never going to be up in the high single digits in this race. I think we're comfortable here. The Georgia race, their polling has been all over the place. There've been some polls now showing him down, but there was a very high quality poll, the Maris poll today in Georgia. Maris is the highest rated pollster on 538. It was a huge poll, 1,200 person sample. Most of these polls are 500, 600 people. So very high quality pollster, massive sample size. Warnock was up 5, right? So I think Democrats, when I talk to them, they feel good about Georgia. I mean, even though some of the polling's been a little bouncier there, I think in general, we feel like we're still in good shape there. Fetterman has obviously overperformed everybody's expectations in Pennsylvania. And then these other races have gotten closer. I mean, there is some evidence that the Republican base is starting to come home. Remember, they're going to get 46% of the vote, 45, 46% of the vote, no matter what. And in a lot of these races, they were down at 41, 42. So they're getting back to a place that is sort of rock bed for them. They were below rock bed in a bunch of these races. And so I think that some of this consolidation of the Republican side is not surprising. Again, the question isn't whether they can get to 45. It's whether they can get to 48, 49, 50, right, where they need to go. So this shows us ahead in the Senate, but it's gotten a little closer, right? A little bit more nail-bitey in the last few days. New Hampshire is turning out well for us, but Wisconsin, I think that may be tougher for us than we thought even a few weeks ago. In the House, we're seeing similar data. It's not a different election. People kept saying, well, the Senate's going to be fine. The House is going to be, the House is gone. I don't know how anybody who's a legitimate commentator could ever say anything like that. It's the same election, same dynamics. And this is just, I selected, it's perhaps a better word, 7 incumbent House Republicans. These are Republican incumbents in the House, all of whom are in uncomfortable places, right? Either trailing or not leading or in the 30s. I just went to 538 and pulled these, which again shows that Republicans are not where they want to be. This is a competitive election. I spent a lot of the last few months, sort of debunking the notion this was a red wave. I think now in DC, it's sort of conventional wisdom that we're looking at a competitive election. And now the question is what happens next. But the big story, right? The thing that really matters is not polling, but actual voting. Actual voting is always more important than polling. And what we see in these special elections and in Kansas is dramatic overperformance by the Democrats. In these 5 special elections that have just taken place, we overperformed our 2020 numbers, an election that we won by 4.5 points, by 7 points. Some of these races, we didn't spend any money. In Nebraska one, we didn't spend any money. And we saw a 10-point improvement from our numbers in 2020. These are all races that happened after Roe ended, right? So the election changed on June 24th. This Nebraska race happened on June 28th, just 4 days later. And I will tell you that commentators, when this happened, I jumped up and down and said, this is a big deal. It was dismissed by the commentariat here in DC, but it sure now looks like it wasn't an outlier, but a harbinger of a new dynamic in the election. And we've won, in New York 19, I spoke to the DCCC, the House Party Campaign Committee, the afternoon of the vote. And they said, look, we think we're going to lose by 3. We're okay here. We're okay with that. We outperformed our internal polling in this race by 5 points. So in actual voting, we are overperforming expectations and our 2020 numbers. And obviously in Kansas, something very dramatic happened. More Democrats voted in Kansas than Republicans. It's almost a statistical impossibility that happened. So we're seeing a huge energized women, particularly young women, by the way, are overperforming their similar margins in 2020, the 2020 elections. Where this is also starting to show up is this new energy from women, and particularly young women, is in voter registration and requesting early ballots. This is Tom Bonnier, who I've been doing some work with, shared yesterday. This is the increase in the gender gap after Dobbs in registration. And even a 2 to 3 point shift would have been dramatic. And you can see in some of these states, we're talking about high single digits. In Pennsylvania, it's 12 points, right? In Alaska, this is a big deal because this is another sort of set of data suggesting the election is heading in a certain direction. And then we also know from states where we have data on early, people requesting mail ballots, which we're starting to get data on that. We're also seeing a similar jump in women compared to the similar jump in women and Democrats, by the way, from where 2020 was. And so the energy right now is with us, and it's being generated by women, and particularly young women. It's not a surprise whose life is being most altered by the ending of Roe. It's young women of childbearing age. And so you're seeing them, they've woken up, and particularly young women are registering in very high numbers. This matters because the part of the electorate that is least likely to vote in a midterm are young people. Young people are plus 20 Democrat. Young women can be plus 30, plus 40 Democrat, depending on the state. So this is a dramatic thing in the election. And it could be why the polling before these elections were undercounting the Democratic number. So the other thing I just want to put an exclamation point, as I was saying earlier, is we're seeing evidence of the Republican coalition cracking up. There is an unprecedented effort by Republicans, prominent Republicans like Liz Cheney and Bill Kristol, Joe Scarborough and others, to tell Republicans not to vote Republican. I mean, we've never seen anything like this before. If we were living in a parliamentary democracy, this would have been a new party that would have split, a center-right party that would have split off from the far-right MAGA party. But we don't do that in American politics. We just have two parties. And so you're seeing this sort of unprecedented effort. Bill Kristol is spending $10 million in battleground states of putting videos on the air of Republicans talking to other Republicans, real people living in those states, about why they shouldn't vote Republican. We've never seen anything like this before. And even if this just nets us 1 or 2 points, right? Think about this. In 2000, the election was decided by less than 600 votes. In 2020, it was decided by 70,000 votes in it's 2016, 70,000 votes in 3 states. This effort by organized Republicans could make a huge difference in keeping their ceiling low in this election. And it's something we need to be talking about more, because it's also an unprecedented event. So just to summarize everything, right? The reality is we're in a very different election now. The opposition to MAGA drove the last 2 elections. I think it's going to drive this one again. And I'm a little bit over time, so I'm just going to cruise through this final bit here. Things I think will still get better for us. And I'll make this deck available, by the way, so if people want to, plow through it. Biden's approval rating has come way, way up. It's a big deal. We can talk more about it. There's a clear sense in the electorate that the Republicans have become extremists, and it's particularly acute with independent voters. And this is really important, right? They don't see the two parties as the same. And NBC just had new polling showing that among something that really mattered in 2018, that this group they call persuadable voters has gone from +6 Republican to +3 Democrat in recent weeks. Let me just do this two last things. I just want to put a plea in for Democrats to start getting more aware of how strong our economic stewardship has been since this new age of globalization began when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The data here I'm about to show you is shocking, right? We've been in office about equal number of time. We've been in office 18 years. They've been in office 16 years. Biden has seen 5 times as many jobs created in his presidency as it was created in the last 3 Republican presidencies combined, right? Biden is producing jobs at 50 times the rate of Republicans over the last 3 presidencies. This isn't really a close call. We have to do better in establishing that we're the party of growth and opportunity. They're the party of recessions and decline. Why? Because the economy is always the number 1 or number 2 issue. And right now we're down to Republicans on the economy, despite this data I just showed you, by 10 to 15 points. It's a problem. This is an Achilles heel for us. If there's anything I'm worried about, this is what I'm worried about here. And I just want to show you this, right? In this age of globalization, there have been 45 million jobs created in America. 96% of them, 43 million, have been created under Democratic presidents. We shouldn't be losing the economic argument to the Republicans because of this extraordinary performance during this more complicated economic era. And so just to sum up, right, we have a shot. We got to leave it all on the playing field now. I'm doing these presentations to anybody who will listen to me to get them all fired up. And thank you for the opportunity today. We need to be more proud of our president and our party. And imagine what we can do with 2 more years of control in Washington. We've only had control in 6 out of the last 42 years in American politics. Joe Biden's done so much in these 2 years. Imagine, just spend time thinking about what we can do next that we didn't get done in the last 2 years. And just to put a pitch in for early voting, and this is important also for your friends in the States, is that voting early is a new thing in our political system because of what's happened with the extension of vote by mail and early voting all across the country, largely due to COVID, is that we have a different electoral system in the United States now than we had even in 2016. And many more people now can vote earlier and have options to vote earlier. So we have to educate Democrats that voting early makes more Democrats and makes the election work better. And so you need to try to vote on the very first day, or at least within the first few days that you're able to. This really matters. So it does for 3 reasons. It relieves the pressure on the electoral system. It makes problems less likely, it makes counting votes easier and faster to count in most places, right? In the US, it takes you off a GOTV list. It means that the campaigns can move on to go get more low propensity voters, because if they can only turn out 10,000 voters, we want them hitting the folks that are less likely to vote, right? Then what you're doing is literally creating more Democrats by voting early. It also does something that I think was really powerful in 2020, which is we start getting this data in of how many people are voting, And then and you're seeing like, oh my God, all these people are voting, I got to vote too, right? It creates this permission structure for people who are on the bubble of whether to vote. Well, man, everybody's voting, I got to go vote, right? That matters for us because we have more episodic voters than they do, right? Because our electorate is younger and we have more new voters. And so this issue of getting that marginal voter to vote is more important for us than it is for them. And this is a powerful new tool. And if there's any other reason why you're here today, that you're going to give money, you're going to vote early, whatever it is you're going to do to help our democracy, there's a lot of really important reasons I've gone through about why you should be enthusiastic in voting early. But let me end with this one, which is that we simply cannot allow these people to be back in control of this building next year. Imagine if they win the election after doing this. It will be an affirmation that this kind of radical, extreme, illiberal politics is now the norm in the Republican Party. The danger to the United States and frankly to the West more broadly cannot be overstated. Stakes in this election are high, and I really appreciate you for being big citizens and being with us here today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Simon. That was great. I'm going to hand things over to Garland, who has been monitoring the question box. I see quite a lot of good and interesting questions coming in. Take it away, Garland.
Okay. This question is from our Brittany Vice Chair, Amy, and she asks, can you please explain why Democrats have to overperform by 3% to keep the House when we currently hold it? I understand why this is required for the Senate and the Electoral College for structural reasons, but not as much for the House. Is it about gerrymandering or something else?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer to that is that in the redistricting in not this time, but the time before, we had a bad redistricting and they had a really good one. And it's created sort of unbelievable structural problems in American politics. I mean, we win in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and they still control 60-70% of the state legislative seats in those states. And so, yeah, I mean, the simple, I could talk about this literally for a very long time, but the simple way to think about this is that our system, there is a bias to rural areas and small states due to the way the math works, where there would be some states that should be at 0 and some, in terms of representation, but we have to give them 1. And so just mathematically what it does, if you can follow the math here, is that basically, there's a rural and small state bias because of the math of the way we do our power allocation that slightly favors the Republicans. And it's just a reality. And, I'm okay with this challenge. We know this and we're running our politics based on this. And I don't know that it's going to be within our power to change that for at least another decade.
Okay, a question from Jane is, why quote mass shootings as a factor for Dems versus Republicans, since it seems that mass shootings have never been a vote change factor? Is this because of the latest SCOTUS ruling?
Yeah, I think it is a voting issue actually for young people. And I think that for young people in the United States post-Parkland, the issue of gun violence and the fact that these were young people that were killed and that we have an entire generation of people in the United States who are now doing duck and cover drills and all the things that they have to do, and sort of the irrationality of the collective response in the US has made this a major issue. I mean, my daughter, I live in DC, my daughter goes to Sidwell Friends, right? There have been 2 shootings within 4 blocks of her school within the last, 6 weeks. And there have been, they had to shut the school down. They weren't at her school, but they were at another school nearby, and then one across the street. The gun violence is a daily occurrence for people in the United States. And this is a voting issue for young people. It played a major role in the 2018 midterms. And so when Uvalde happened, and then there was another mass shooting that happened right after that, I think it started waking. If part of what happened over the last few months is that young people started waking up and realizing that even if they were disappointed in Biden and saw Biden as kind of an old man who was very distant from them, a series of things have happened that have woken young people up. The mass shootings that took place, the abortion, which is, radically alters the life of young Americans in those states where restrictions are in place. The climate bill that we passed, super important for young people. And so I think that young people now have a whole lot, many more reasons to, participate in this election, which was really important because there had been a growing distance between Biden and the Democratic Party and young people. And I think that a lot of that gap has been closed in recent weeks. So we need young people not only vote for us, but to vote in large numbers. And I think that's much more likely to occur now.
There's several questions about the economy. One of which is that, we still have 7 weeks to go, I think, 48 days. And the news from the market is not great. There's also a question about the fact that one of the things you talked about in your presentation is that they have such a good brand, seemingly from no performance, about
Yes.
being good for the economy. What
Yeah.
are the most effective ways to counter those two
So
problems?
I want to say that I have been on a crusade for years to get Democrats to recognize that the structure, that our underperformance on economic issues is a thing that is preventing us from being the party that we want to be. It's preventing us from winning elections in the way that we want to win. And that there needs to be an effort, a party-wide effort, to figure out why this is the case. That basically we've been really good and they've been really bad, and everyone thinks the exact opposite, right? Is that, we need to have a party-wide commitment to close the gap here and to fix this. I've been successful at certain things in my career. This is not one of them. And I have been spending a lot of time with the Biden White House on these matters. And if you read my materials, there is a steady stream of Simon saying we have to close on the economy. Simon says we have to focus on the economy. Simon says we have to win the economic argument. And I'm hopeful that as we make our plans to close here, that, closing the economic gap is our highest priority, because I think it's the part of the information that we can give voters that is something they don't already know. Voters already know that we're pro-choice and Republicans aren't. Voters already know that Republicans are kind of crazy. Voters already know that inflation was too high. Voters already know that Democrats perhaps are a little bit soft on immigration. What do voters not know? What can advertising do, and what information can we provide to voters that could be material? Well, we can explain to them that, we have, in the last few months, we've had the lowest during the Biden presidency. Just to give you a couple stats, and how we figure out how to explain this is something else, but we've had the lowest unemployment rate in a peacetime American economy since the end of World War II. We've had the lowest poverty rate ever in the history of the United States. We've had the lowest uninsured rate in the history of the United States. We are averaging twice as many new businesses being formed every month than is the historical norm, and this has been going on for a year and a half. We had more jobs created last year than any year in American history. Real wages are up again, and nominal wages are increasing at 7% a month, which is among the highest ever recorded in American history. Right now, the truth is that we're living through one of the most dynamic, vibrant, successful American economies in the history of America, and nobody knows that. And so this is not just a question about us getting credit. There's a poll question that Navigator asked at the beginning of 2022, which is, do you think more jobs were created in 2021 or in 2020? So this is not a question about how do you feel, right? It's like, so this is a basic fact question. So in 2020, America lost 3 million jobs. In 2021, we gained 8 million, the most ever in a single year. So it shouldn't be a hard question, right? Only 30% shows that we created more jobs in 2021 than 2020, which I've argued is the equivalent of, in 1946, only 30% of Americans knowing that we won World War II, right? And so, there is a level of information distortion about the economy that is actually, I think, deeply unhealthy, because the American people have something really fundamentally false and wrong about something that really matters about their country. And we have to make a sustained effort to correct the record here. I'm hoping this is how we close. And certainly if it doesn't get done this time, there needs to be more emphasis. And one of the reasons I'm doing events like this is that all of you can help me, right? Take my charts, take my graphs, steal them, right? Put them out there to your friends. Make this part of what it means to be a Democrat, that we have to position ourselves as a party of growth and opportunity and success, then they're the party of recession, spiraling deficits, and decline. And by the way, that's true, right? I mean, it's manifestly true, in addition to being, the data being correct, decline versus progress. That's the fundamental difference between the two parties right now.
Great, thank you. One question that we've had come up on our Twitter feed is strategists and polls predicted that Hillary would win in 2016. So can we still trust them?
Yep. So this comes up quite a bit. And let me just say the polls weren't wrong in 2016. The election changed. And, Hillary was going to win the election comfortably. She was up 5 or 6 points. The data is very clear on this. And then Comey changed the election. And if Comey had not intervened, she would have won handily. So the polls weren't wrong. And this is a Republican talking point to sort of spook out the Democrats, right? In 2020, they did overstate Democrat support in some states. Nate Cohn in the New York Times just wrote about this. But in 2018, they were very spot on. I mean, there wasn't polling error, if you want to call it that. As I went through earlier, I think if there's going to be polling error this time, it may be beneficial to us. I mean, meaning that we may be underestimating our level of support right now in polling. And certainly I think that's more likely than the opposite. Remember this idea of this hidden Trump voter that's sort of become this superpower that Republicans have. This, it's a dark marble-like power that Republicans have. Didn't play out when Trump wasn't on the ballot in 2018, right? The numbers, 538's polling and everything else was very accurate. Our polling was very accurate. Trump's not on the ballot now. So, I mean, I feel good about where we are. And again, all polling can do is it's a suggestion of where things are right now. Things can change. This election will change. I think if it does change, it's more likely that it changes in our favor than their favor, because I think they are in a unrelenting sort of negative set of news cycles that they just can't get themselves out of, because Trump's daily depravities and malevolence is sort of dominating, the news coverage of the Republican Party. And I just don't think I think he loves that. I think he enjoys it and he wants to keep it going. And, if they want to spend the next 2 months having Donald Trump remind us every day that he's betrayed the country on a serial basis and it may have caused the greatest security breach in the history of Western democracies, I'm happy for them to have that be the basic thing that they're talking about every day, as opposed to all the other things that they want to talk about.
So do you have any House races that you think would have the most impact for keeping the House? And if so, could you share those with us? Because we have members voting all over the world all over these districts.
So I give kind of a political answer to that question, to be honest, which is that here's the true answer. We don't really know, because polling in House races is hard. There are more undecideds late because people don't really care about the House. So they're, you have much more sort of firm data about the Senate races than you do about the House races. And so if you want to, what I recommend to people that they do is they go to the DCCC website, which is the House Campaign Committee. They have a list of every targeted race, incumbents, and also challengers, and go there and pick 5 candidates that you like. I mean, they're all competitive. And anything that's on that list right now can go either way. We just don't know. And we don't have granular level data because you can't get to that degree of certainty in the House, because you have to do 40 polls. You'd have to do them weekly, right? Nobody's spending that kind of money. So we just have it's a little bit more of a guessing game. But I recommend to people, I think that people like to pick people that they have preferences. I'd rather support women this cycle. I'd like to be with veterans. I grew up in the West and I want to support people in the West. Pick people that you have an emotional connection to, right? Give them some money. And also in many of these races, you can make GOTV phone calls if the time works out. The time difference is a little bit of a problem. Not on the weekends, but during the week, it would be a little bit of a problem. But you can also now in all of our campaigns, you can make GOTV calls into these districts where you just email the campaigner. If there's a volunteer button, you can say, I'd like to make phone calls for you. You can do it on the internet, so you're not paying, phone charges. And, I made 10 hours of calls for Terry McAuliffe from down the hall here. I made 12 hours of calls for Biden in 2020 from down the hall in my house. And you can now do that in any race in the country. That's a new technological innovation. And the reason this matters is that this is a turnout election. We just got to get, there's a lot more of us than them. We won the last 2 elections by 6.5 points. We got to 52.5. If we can just get 50% to show up, we win, right? Basically. And so just these GOTV calls we already have a list of everyone in every House district who we know voted for us in the last 2 elections, who we think based on various psychographic things may not be voting this time. We already have that list. Every campaign has that list. You can call 500 of those people between now and election day and just leave messages, talk to them. And I can tell you that in my 10 hours of phone calls for Terry, I probably gave Terry 6 votes. People didn't know their polling location. They didn't know how to early vote. They had a question. With Biden, maybe it was 8 votes. But imagine if 10,000 people do that, right? And that's the power of this new sort of post-COVID. You could always give money for years to a candidate not in your district or not in your state. Now you can actually volunteer and do voter contact. And that's a new innovation. And so check it out.
Thank you.
And House more than Senate for obvious reasons, right? They need the money more.
Yes, they do. So historically, Democrats have been labeled successfully by Republicans as the big spenders. And we have been proposing since Biden took office some big dollar spending that was very important and went directly to people's pockets. We talk a lot on our Twitter, on our social media channels about how, that's really local stimulus money. But how do we, if that becomes part of the messaging, how do we talk about our spending in a way that makes it clear that it's not driving inflation in particular?
Yeah, this is a complicated question. I'll try to give us a short answer because it is that. So one is where they're spending money right now. What they're putting on the air is crime and immigration. There is a wide held belief that the inflation argument has lost some of its power because gas prices have come down so much. And here in the US, the inflation conversation was gas prices, because as you know, the numbers are up on the boards everywhere. You drive around, you see it, right? And it was shocking. It went way up here. And obviously 2/3 of it went up after Putin started mobilizing against Ukraine, but that is what it is. The gas has come way, way down here. And we know that particularly for Republican voters who tend to be in more rural and exurban districts and perhaps drive more fuel inefficient cars, the truth is that inflation for the average worker over the last year has not been that big a deal, right? It's because wages have gone up so much. And so, the real impact of inflation has been 1 or 2%. Real wages have been down. They were up in 2021. They went underneath when the war started in Ukraine because gas went up so much. But the truth is that if you're not a heavy driver, inflation was an annoyance. It wasn't a destabilizing economic event for you. If you drove a lot, it was a destabilizing economic event. I mean, it was, as you know, how different people are here in the US, right? My wife grew up in New Mexico and, everyone there drives 30, 40 miles all the time. And so their economic lives have changed in the last year and a half. It's why there's so much intensity in the Republican Party around inflation and gas prices. Well, guess what? I mean, gas prices have plummeted down. And so it's drained the psychological connection to the rising prices, in part because the rest of rising prices actually haven't gone up as much as Republicans have argued, right? It was really about gas always. So they are floundering around a little bit right now. Historically, if they're talking about crime and immigration at the end of the election, they don't do well in those elections. Those are not swing voter issues. They need to come back and reconnect on economic issues somehow. And that's why what I'm proposing is we should anticipate that and get ahead of that and know that that's where they're going to end up, because where they are now, Donald Trump spent the last month of the 2018 election talking about the caravans, and we won by 8.5 points. And I can tell you, as somebody who's worked on immigration for 20 years, Republicans usually only talk about immigration in primaries. They don't talk about it in the general election because it isn't a voting issue for most Americans. They care about it, but they care about other stuff more. But Republican primary voters care about it a lot. And that's why one way to read what DeSantis is doing right now is that he's already running for president. This is for him. This is 2023 primary stuff to sort of stake out a signal to Republican primary voters. I don't think this stuff, I think my own gut is the stunts that DeSantis is doing is actually going to hurt Republicans. If anything, if there's any benefit to either party, I think it's actually going to hurt them. So I think that on the issue of spending, Republicans, there was an article, I'll try to remember, before we go, I'll try to remember, there was an article saying, oh, Ronna Romney McDaniel, the RNC put out a memo, which you can find online, where they acknowledge that people actually don't think inflation happened because of Democratic spending. They think it happened because of the war, but by the way, which is true. They think it happened because of COVID, which is true, and supply chain disruptions, which is true. And in fact, we all know that one of the reasons inflation happened in the US is because the economy grew too fast, right? And so there's a much more nuanced understanding on inflation. It was never as clean a win for Republicans as they advertised. And also we can counter the spending argument with the deficit, the massive deficit reduction. I mean, Joe Biden's now the third consecutive Democratic president to see a massive reduction in the deficit on his watch. There's been a huge increase of deficits in the last three Republicans. There's no greater myth in American politics than the Republicans being the party of fiscal responsibility. I mean, that's just wrong.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, that's all the time we have for questions. I'm going to turn things back over to Danny for a quick recap, and then I will come back in and we'll wrap up the seminar.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Simon. This has been absolutely fascinating, and it's extremely inspiring for us. Really, we are already doing everything we can to get out the vote. We're going to do everything more that we can possibly do. Keep going and make sure that not only everybody abroad that we can get to vote Democrat, but also people that we know in the United States, with your very good advice about voting early and making sure to get out the word. So this has been very inspiring, also giving us great messaging, great talking points, the things that we need to be saying on our social media, on our Twitter feeds, on our newsletters and everything. So all of this information is very, very helpful for us. Thank you so much. So again, I want to thank our organizers. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Garland. Thank you again, Simon. And also just to remind people, please, obviously you have registered to vote and requested your ballot. I hope that if you're here, you have done that. Please get everybody you know to do so. Please help Democrats abroad also by donating. That'd be very, very helpful for us. Your dollars are translated into getting more people to vote. So again, thank you so much. Back to you, Amy.
Thank you. Just a reminder about voting early. Americans abroad, if you've registered from votefromabroad.org, our ballot drop day is this Saturday, September 24th. So we can all vote early. And I see that Garland just dropped in the chat a very cool event that's happening on Saturday, which is the ballot day rally. We're going to have Nancy Pelosi and a bunch of candidates, John Fetterman and Kevin Bacon and Kyra Sedgwick and some other cool celebs to show up, and we're all going to talk about voting early. So I would like to thank Simon again for spending some time with Democrats abroad, getting us fired up and ready to go. We are very grateful for the tremendous work you're doing in the US, and we will keep up the fight on our end. We'll be putting in the chat box all the links you need for social media for DA France anyway. So to stay abreast of what's going on, please opt in to receive our bi-monthly email and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are recording, and the recording will be available on the Democrats Abroad YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. Again, thanks, Simon, and we'll see you soon.